Hi guys, I'm here with Nick, who's one of the co-founders of Harmony Protocol. Nick, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. Looking forward to talking about sharding and all things Harmony.
Yeah, so good you mentioned sharding. Let's get right into it. So Harmony Protocol is a public blockchain, and like you rightly said, the key value proposition is sharding. Some of our listeners who may not yet know what sharding is, could you briefly talk about what it is and why is it important?
For sure. So people have probably heard a lot the word sharding. It's being thrown around by many different projects. And our particular flavor of sharding is deep sharding. That's what sets us apart from the rest of the sharding protocols. We're also proof of stake, which not every sharding protocol is. But first, let's talk about why sharding is important. So sharding is this concept that comes from traditional databases originally. And it's this concept that if you have too much data to store in one server, you need to find some way of having multiple servers connect together. You imagine if you're Google and you're trying to store the entire internet, you won't be able to store that on one computer. So sharding is really necessary when you try to scale databases. And in some ways, blockchain is a database. And as we've run into the limits of how much you can process on one single blockchain, we've realized that we need to split it into multiple blockchains and run them side by side. So that's the concept of sharding, is that as you need more throughput, as you have more demands on the network, you add more shards, you add more nodes to the network to parallelize the blockchain and add more throughput.
Right. And so there was this concept that I think we briefly touched upon. We've interviewed Zilliqa in the past, which is, I think, one of the first public blockchains that kind of brought sharding into the fore. And so Zilliqa has managed to do what is called network sharding or transaction sharding, but they don't do what is called state sharding, whereas you guys have managed to achieve that. So I want to talk about how you actually achieve state sharding. But before that, could you explain what the difference between these two types of sharding is? So what is transaction sharding versus what is state sharding?
Absolutely. So transaction sharding is the concept that we can parallelize the verification and validation of transactions that are going through the network. So that means that each shard doesn't need to pay attention what the other shards are doing as far as approving transactions and making sure that they're legitimate. But at the same time, the beacon shard, or there may be some overseeing shard that is keeping track of the overall state of the network and keeping an eye on all the lower shards to make sure that there's no fraud happening. So that's transaction sharding, and as you may see in that example, there's sort of a bottleneck. The beacon shard will inevitably have to keep track of all the state of the entire network. So the state being the balances of accounts or the variables in smart contracts. So as you add more shards, eventually the state shard, the beacon chain will run out of space, so to speak. So the difference between transaction sharding and state sharding is that in state sharding, you don't have a single shard that acts as the bottleneck that has to store the entire state of the whole network. Instead, each shard keeps track of its own state. And that way, even as you add more shards, you don't have the bottleneck of one shard being overloaded with having to keep track of too much memory. So that's the key difference. And I'm not too familiar with exactly Zilliqa's approach, but in our approach, yeah, it's essentially we figured out a way to make it such that the sharding is secure enough that we don't have to necessarily look after each shard from the top level. Definitely the beacon chain will help to keep track of some certain things, but it doesn't have to know the full state of each sub-shard.
Right. So, I mean, kind of digging a little bit deeper into what you just said. So you said that there's actually no kind of place where you actually have the entire chain. So the entire chain is kind of sharded within, is kept within each shard. So is it something like, is there some sort of mechanism where the shards are speaking to each other? It's like, how do you know the overall state? How do you know the overall state of the blockchain?
Exactly. So that's another piece actually that people don't necessarily talk too much about, but there's also this idea of, I want to say networking sharding or bandwidth sharding in terms of, or communication sharding is what I think I should call it, which is that in a lot of cases, the beacon chain acts as a routing through point through which all the shards have to, in order to communicate to another shard, they send their transaction first to the beacon chain, which then sends it to the destination shard. And the problem is that also becomes a bottleneck, right? Then the beacon chain, as you add more shards, has to route more and more transactions. So what we use is a concept called Kademlia routing, which is actually very popular in torrent systems. It's a way of keeping track of a subgroup of peers with a topography that allows you to locate an endpoint peer in a sort of logarithmic number of steps. So what that allows us to do is have the shards talk to each other in a sort of peer-to-peer fashion, if you will, but with a logarithmic scaling, meaning as you add more shards, it doesn't blow up. So that's another key part of it. And just to kind of dive a little bit more into how cross-shard transactions work, if I'm sending some, let's say some Harmony 1 tokens from one shard to another, what first happens is the first originating shard creates a lock on this balance, and then it sends the receipt of this locked transaction, like a proof that these funds have been locked here, and it sends it to the destination shard. The destination shard then verifies that this is a valid lock, the proof is true, and then they generate the funds on their own side. So it's sort of an atomic thing. If the destination shard does not approve, then the funds will become unlocked in the originating shard. So it's a way of transferring value or state between the shards in a way that maintains security.
Right. And is that how a standard transaction would look like?
Not necessarily. So if you're within, I think the likelihood of cross-shard transactions is relatively high, and depending on the way that you also, there's different optimizations you can make in terms of putting certain functions, certain geographies or people or smart contracts in one shard, so you can minimize the amount of cross-shard communication that has to happen. But a transaction that doesn't need to go cross-shard can just stay within its own shard and not sort of instigate any of this complex stuff happening cross-shard.
Right. And so again, I guess I don't want to go too deep and kind of lose the audience as well, but I still want to pick up on this point. So if I'm an application developer, do I have to pick a particular shard on top of which I'm building? And am I able to leverage like different shards? Is that how it's built? Or is that a completely wrong way to think about it?
So as an application developer, you will deploy your smart contract to a particular shard. At the end of the day, your smart contract will have to exist on a certain shard. In theory, actually, you can.
Sorry. Sorry. And am I, as an application developer, picking which shard I want to deploy my smart contract on?
Not necessarily. I think you could choose the address of the smart contract. It depends on which way the sharding is performed. In some ways, you could choose an address for the smart contract that places you in a certain shard. But if you're you can always deploy multiple smart contracts on multiple shards as well, if that makes sense. But I think in many cases it wouldn't make sense unless you run into the limits of throughput within your particular shard.
Right. So taking a step back, I mean, we've spoken, I think we've mentioned the word sharding, I think 20, 30 times in the last 10 minutes we've been speaking. I think the bigger problem that we're trying to solve here is scalability, right? And there's multiple ways to solve the scalability problem. There's side chains, there's delegated proof of stake consensus mechanism. Is there a particular reason why you chose to go the sharding route?
Yeah, so people probably have heard of this idea called the scalability trilemma. And the scalability trilemma is this idea that there's a trade-off, tripartite trade-off between security, scalability, and decentralization. And many previous attempts to scale blockchains have resulted in a sacrifice on security or a sacrifice on decentralization. And in the past few years, and hats off to the authors of Elastico, which are also the founders of Zilliqa, they were some of the first people to apply this concept of sharding to blockchains. And sharding became a very promising approach in which you could actually achieve strong security and scalability without sacrificing decentralization. So if you think about an approach like EOS, for example, by comparison, they are choosing to limit the number of block producers to 21. Obviously, that gives them some form of scalability, and you could say they're secure, but they're really not very decentralized. If you only have 21 block producers, and then in fact then in some ways decentralization and security are sort of the same thing, depending on your definition of security. Because if you only have 21, in a political sense, it's less secure, because if you only have 21 people who are kind of running the network, it's much easier to corrupt, which is less secure. And if you think about another approach, let's say sidechains in a lot of ways, I think that they have, in layer 2 solutions, I think they have a strong reason to exist, and I think they will actually be layered on top of sharded protocols, but they make oftentimes they sort of divide the security. You can, in a sharded protocol, you can unify the security of all these different shards together into one cohesive whole, whereas in a layer 2 solution, oftentimes you're sort of separating the security generated on layer 2 from the security on layer 1. And layer 2 can leverage layer 1, but layer 2 doesn't contribute to the security of layer 1. So the beauty of sharding is essentially that you get the at least so far the best trade-off on this three-way sort of trilemma. And I think the hardest part is actually that it becomes much more difficult from an engineering standpoint to implement, which is why it's taking these teams much longer to ship these sharded protocols than it is to build something like EOS or Plasma type of solution. But that's right. The idea. That's why people have taken the sharded approach, because so far it's the best thing that we've been able to come up with.
Right. That makes absolute sense. You did allude to the fact that you have staking mechanism within your protocol. Could you talk about how that works? What are the staking rewards, and what does it take to be a validator?
Yeah, so another important part of what we think defines scalability is not just throughput. So people really have fixated on TPS as a metric that defines how good or bad a blockchain is. But for us, it's not just about throughput. It's also about latency, meaning time to finality. So when I send a transaction, how quickly does it go through? And then finally, it's also about cost. How expensive is it for me to send a transaction? How expensive is it to use this public utility, this blockchain? And so that's where this proof of stake comes in. It's a really important decision that we made early on, is to go with proof of stake, because your security mechanism is no longer dependent on burning a lot of electricity and buying a lot of very expensive hardware. Your security is now generated through the value of the token itself. So there's actually really, I think, it's a very useful new tool that people have developing these new sort of generation of blockchain. So we have a proof of stake protocol, and we've intentionally made it very, we've designed our protocol so it only requires a low resource node if you want to join the network. So that way, it's not as expensive as having a super node like EOS, where you have to have top of the line hardware. And second of all, it becomes more decentralized. We'll have more nodes with lower resources, but together, because we parallelize and add all the resources together, we have that added benefit. But the rewards and the economics are still in development for the most part, and I'm not supposed to promise any return on investment. But if you stake, you will earn block rewards, so it will offset your the costs of running the node, and you'll have you'll be able to participate in the network.
And what does it take to be a validator?
So what it takes to be a validator is you will need a minimum number of Harmony tokens. It's somewhat dependent. We have sort of this thresholded proof of stake idea, which means that if you make the threshold of enough stake, you'll be given 1 voting share in the protocol. And each shard will have around 400 to 600 voting shares. And with your voting share, you get to participate and validate blocks and earn rewards. As far as the hardware resources are concerned, we've been running our nodes on AWS T3 medium instances, which have roughly 2 cores and 4 gigabytes of memory. So it's pretty minimal. Running a node like that for a month is probably less than $50. I would guess. So you could probably even run it on your laptop at home. Obviously, you wouldn't want to be using your laptop at the same time. So, but that's sort of the idea. It doesn't take very much. We're also engaging a lot of the top staking as a service providers in the space, and even ones who are taking more of a cloud approach, where you can create an account and spin up your own node in the cloud with very little effort. But you don't have to actually give your tokens to some other company to stake them on your behalf. So that we're really trying to build out a validator community, and most of all keep it decentralized, so that people don't have to be experts to participate, and that we don't end up with these monopolies over all the stake. That we have this ability to fall back to just normal hardware, I think is really important for the security and robustness of the protocol.
Right. So we've spoken about sharding. I want to switch gears a little bit, and scalability as well. I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about this other problem that exists with a lot of the public blockchains, and that's governance. Especially because a lot of these public blockchains, the objective is to be decentralized. And there's been huge debates going on either side of the camp. There's the off-chain camp where people feel that governance still needs to be, we live in the real world and governance still needs to be kind of off-chain. There is also an on-chain camp. Where do you guys fall, and how do you guys see yourselves evolving to also ensure that you guys stay decentralized, if not initially, then sort of in the longer run?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think initially there's so much changing and there's so much work still to be done. I think every protocol needs to have some form of leadership and needs to have some way of making decisions that can be executed faster. Otherwise, I think you could end up in sort of a lockdown in the same way that Bitcoin is. And I think it's fine for Bitcoin because it doesn't need to evolve. It's actually sort of found its niche and found its use case. But for a protocol like ours that needs to constantly improve, and we need to be able to update and adapt much faster. So I think at the beginning, there will probably still be quite a bit of leadership from the team, but of course we'll keep a lot of the consideration for our community, because at the end of the day, you don't want your community, what gives your blockchain value is the community and what they want. So we're going to focus not on any sort of political things, but on how to keep the protocol competitive and how to keep it state of the art. But eventually, and even at the outset, we will have on-chain governance mechanisms in the form of voting. So using sort of basic kind of token voting. I think the issue is we would love to do more interesting things, but until we found a really good solution for on-chain identity, it's hard to implement a lot of these more futuristic governance ideas regarding, let's say, quadratic voting or other ideas that people have thrown out there. It's a little bit more difficult to implement something more interesting than just pro rata token voting. But we're definitely, I think governance in the long run is a huge issue. And in fact, one of our networking engineers has worked a lot on internet protocols and seen the governance of how, when a new standard is rolled out for internet protocols or for crypto kinds of security things, there's a very like intense process that goes on, and there's sort of also a very much a software element of trying to make that transition very smooth. So he's been thinking a lot about how to take the lessons from these more traditional industries that have been around much longer and implement them in a blockchain setting. So I think that there's still a lot of work to be done. I think governance is definitely one of the most important topics, but I think we're still at a very early stage where a lot of these ideas, we need more infrastructure and we need to remain nimble at the same time. So we'll see how it evolves, but I would say that we're very, very careful about this, and we know the impact that it has on the overall global community that we're trying to build.
Right. So again, so I think, so we've spoken about scalability and governance. I want to move on to the application layer and kind of find out what kind of applications are sort of already in the pipeline that are looking to build on top of Harmony, or what kind of entrepreneurs would you guys like to attract in the future to be building on top of Harmony?
Sure. So we've gotten a lot of interest from enterprises as well as more DApp style of projects. And so we've signed over 30 partnerships in the last few months, and we're seeing a lot of momentum because the truth is that a lot of projects, both enterprises and these DApps, really do care about scalability. It really is a pain point. They want a blockchain that gives a better user experience, meaning that there's faster finality. They also want a blockchain that is not as expensive and one that can actually scale to having, let's say, millions of users. And we really have designed our blockchain to fit those needs, and so it's been really nice to see that the reception is good so far. So we're in talks with projects in the DeFi space, stable coins, people doing security tokens, decentralized exchanges. We are also in talks with a lot of gaming companies. We have Animoca that we've signed on, as well as a platform called Contentos that leverages actually a traditional app with 60 million monthly active users. And they're really trying to roll out more blockchain games onto their platform and get these 60 million active users playing on blockchain games. And then finally, we have a lot of different enterprise use cases and sort of more in the public sector. For example, use cases around land registry or around tracking of pharmaceuticals. We signed a partnership with a company doing FDA-approved pilot of tracking pharmaceutical products as they travel around the world, so that the doctors can verify the provenance of these pharmaceuticals at the endpoint before they're used. So it's really a broad range of different use cases, but I think that we'll be able to scale and bring on. Previously, I think there's a lot of people that have kind of been held back from entering blockchain because of the scalability issues. And I think that once we've demonstrated a few of these, there will be a lot more knocking at our door and wanting to give it a try themselves.
Sure. And if I'm already an existing application and I'm facing some scalability issues and I want to kind of port over to Harmony, how is that process? I mean, is that going to be an easy process, or is there going to be significant steps required in terms of doing that migration?
It'll be really straightforward and easy. So we are EVM compatible. So almost you can take your DApp and your contracts off the shelf from wherever they are in Ethereum and port them over to our system with very, very little effort. We've also built out all the same tooling. We've borrowed a lot of the tooling from the Ethereum ecosystem. So you'll have Truffle, MetaMask, Remix, all the things that developers have come to really rely on when they're building their D applications. So we're trying to make it as frictionless as possible because, as I said, obviously the cost, the throughput, and the latency are very important considerations, but DApp developers also very much care about the ecosystem and the tooling. So tooling we have, and the ecosystem is all about attracting a critical mass of applications onto our protocol. And for now, I would say Ethereum has by far the largest and most robust ecosystem of protocols and developers. So by piggybacking onto this EVM and Ethereum ecosystem, hopefully we can grow ours that much faster.
Right. In terms of fundraising, you're obviously having your token sale on Binance very soon, which is quite exciting. But where are you in terms of your development? When can we expect Harmony to go live?
So Harmony will start a throttled mainnet launch. So it's sort of between the testnet and a mainnet, but we're calling it the sort of throttled mainnet launch, meaning that people will be able to start earning tokens as validators on our network that will be converted in a fraction. So you'll say, let's say 10% of the tokens that you earn in block rewards will actually turn into real mainnet tokens. But we'll be launching that throttled mainnet in June. So it's coming up very soon. And we think this is really important because this is how we're going to really, it's not about, some saving up and launching only when everything's perfect. We believe in sort of the iterative software development process where you learn as you go. And then I think when we're stable and we're secure and we feel very confident, that's when we'll kind of flip the switch and go full mainnet. But it's more of a gradual process. And we want to incentivize people to participate in the meantime, because the only way that we'll know how our protocol is performing, testnets only take you so far. You need to actually have something that's live and which the public is interacting with. So so we'll be launching the throttled mainnet this June and slowly ramping up to the full mainnet down the line. But the IEO is ongoing now, and we'll finish, I think, on May 26th, something like that. And we're really excited because I think this will enable us to reach a much broader audience. It's really important for a protocol to have as many stakeholders as possible, because the stakeholders are the ones that are really going to spread the word for you and be your evangelists. And that's what's going to also attract more developers to the platform. Is in some ways, when you have more stakeholders, you have a larger user base, you have a larger footprint. So I think this is a really strategic and important new development for us as we try to build out a global ecosystem.
Yeah, we'll try to make sure that we time the release of the podcast along with before your token sale actually ends. But let's see. It really depends on my editors. So before we wrap up, one final question. So this podcast is called Decrypt Asia, and Asia is turning out to be, one of the, or if not the most important location globally as far as this industry goes. I want to kind of know if you have some particular or some important plans for this part of the world. I know you guys are based in the Valley, but are you kind of considering opening up an office in this part of the world?
So that's a really good point. And actually, before I joined Harmony, I was based in Hong Kong for a year and a half. And I actually go back to Hong Kong every few months. I have a lot of friends there. So I think Asia is really top of the mind for us. We realize that there's a lot of benefit to being in both the West and Asia. I think in where we are in the Bay Area, there's a lot of projects and teams being built, but I think there's a lot of adoption happening on the other side of the Pacific. So we've been out to Asia now, I think 3 times in the last year, doing roadshows in Southeast Asia, obviously Singapore, Hong Kong, Vietnam, and Indonesia. We've also done a lot through China and Korea. So Asia to us is a place where there's a very large user base, and there's a population that's hungry to adopt the new latest technology. And there's also a lot of companies there that want to be the leaders in this new space. I think that for the internet revolution, the U.S. had a bit of a head start, and in this case, Asian companies and countries are really wanting to be at the front lines, at the bleeding edge, and so that's why Asia to us is a very exciting place to go and visit. And I think eventually we will be opening offices. We already have remote communities in a lot of Asian countries, including India and Indonesia and Vietnam, China, Korea. So we're definitely trying to expand our footprint there, and we'll be also trying to launch local companies. For example, in Korea, we're talking to a company about building a Korean entity that will be able to sign contracts and help grow with enterprise adoption locally in Korea, because I think there's a lot of advantages to having a local entity in these countries for the different benefits and the way that the sort of political systems work. So definitely Asia is a huge focus for our team. And I also want to mention that most of our team is Asian originally. So Stephen, our CEO, is originally from Hong Kong. We have 3 engineers who originally grew up in China. We have 1 from Vietnam, 2 from Korea, 2 from India. So Asia is very much in our DNA. And so you'll be seeing a lot of us there as well.
Awesome. Yeah, looking forward to it. I think that's a great note to end the interview on as well. Nick, thank you so much for taking the time. It was an absolute pleasure to speak.
Thank you. Yeah, it's my pleasure. And thanks everyone for listening.